I'm Jared Zimmer, the Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute. And in this episode, Bishop Barron has a conversation with Mr. Sohrab Ahmari, the op-ed editor at the New York Post, where they discuss his latest book, The Unbroken Thread. In this conversation, they discuss the great ideas of numerous thinkers, including Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, and some you might not think of, such as Andrea Dworkin and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. They get into the story of Maximilian Kolbe, the great martyr of the Nazi regime. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Sit back and relax. All right, Sohrab, Bishop, it's great to have you guys here, and I'm so excited about this conversation about your newest book, The Unbroken Thread. And I thought that maybe to start the conversation, I'd ask the question about the impetus of the book and why now?
Sure, it's a book that's born of my anxieties as a relatively young father. I began writing it when my son, Maximilian, was 2 years old. He's now 4. And I began to have anxieties that I never did when I was, single, unmarried, in my 20s, working as a journalist, kind of traveling around the world. But suddenly, I now have this son, and I began to think about what kind of a man our world will chisel out of him, our culture will chisel out of him. So his name is Maximilian, and he's named after St. Maximilian Kolbe. On the one hand, I look at his patron saint and his life, which I only learned about after being received into the church in 2016. That's a longer, separate story. And then I thought, okay, there's a gap between what our culture will expect of my son, how it will shape him, and the culture that led a Franciscan friar to lay down his life for a stranger at Auschwitz. And I want to bridge that gap using a thread, if you will, hence the thread in the title. And that thread is, broadly speaking, tradition, both tradition as the church understands it with a capital T, but also other traditions from which you can draw natural wisdom, whether that's Confucius or someone like Seneca. So the book I decided to write was a series of questions that our culture doesn't ask that I think are important for my son's being able to live a truly happy life and truly fulfilling himself as a human being, and what he's made for, really. And each one, because I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a theologian, I'm just a journalist, I'm a storyteller, each one of those questions is explored through the life of one great thinker. So there's a kind of mini biography. But the main impotence is basically that, I'm worried about my son.
Yeah, that's great. And to have the inspiration of a saint to create that thread and such a beautiful story there. I love how you lay out the book where you start off with questions particularly about their own life, but then also God in particular, and then lead into questions about humanity. And I think maybe to start off as well is to get into, in the first chapter, you get into the problem of scientism, and you discuss C.S. Lewis, particularly his space trilogy. And I know that's a big question we're always talking about, the problem of scientism. So maybe provide a little bit of insight into what you write in that chapter.
Sure. So because this is a book where I want to shake my son and hopefully the reader out of some of the certainties that our age takes for granted, I knew I had to start with a question of science, because science is this incredible endeavor that has unlocked the mysteries of physical reality for us. But there is this ideology built around science and a set of claims that are not themselves scientific claims. They're ideological claims or philosophical claims, but because they carry the prestige of natural science, a lot of people think, philosophy, religion, metaphysics, those questions have all been either answered in a definitive way by scientific inquiry or supplanted where they're not even necessary. And so that creates, I think, a problem, because it creates two kinds of ideas. One, which is facts, which is definitive, you can measure it, you can sense it, you can express it in mathematical language. And then this other provisional category of ideas, opinions, myths, emotions, which are you can't base your judgment around them ultimately, because they're not scientific. So I had to try to break that barrier, and the best critic, I think, in the 20th century, at least, of this kind of scientistic mindset is no better than C.S. Lewis.
Yeah. Bishop, what do you kind of think about, especially Lewis being kind of a literary form of going after this kind of issue of scientism?
Yeah, well, first of all, I quite agree. It's maybe obstacle one as I deal with, especially younger people and trying to evangelize. It's just rampant in our culture that the only legitimate form of knowledge is scientific knowledge. Therefore, what's outside of the sciences is fantasy or superstition or something that's been, superseded. And to open up other avenues that are rational, that are truth-bearing but not scientific, is a huge priority, I think, in our time. And so someone like Lewis, who was a philosopher, is a linguist, he was a philologist, et cetera, was able to show that, and that a story can be truth-bearing and can actually evangelize the imagination, leading to religion, which is a truth-bearing reality, but are not scientific. But it's very hard for people, I can testify to that, very hard for young people to see beyond the scientific worldview. And you're quite right in saying that scientism is not scientific. Scientism is a philosophical perspective, like naturalism or materialism. They don't get that, though, very often. It's just the air they breathe. They take it so for granted. Of course, all there is matter and motion, of course. But why would you say of course to that? Hardly anyone in our great tradition, would have agreed with that claim, but it's taken just so for granted. But that gets in the way of evangelization massively, Can I say one quick word about Maximilian Kolbe, too? Because I love the fact that you start with him. You had sent the book to me, and I had begun reading it. And right after that, I went to St. Maximilian Kolbe Parish, which is in my pastoral region here, for a confirmation. And I often just sort of riff on the kids' names, the confirmation names. And there were, I think, 3 in that parish who took the name Maximilian. And so I said, you guys know the story of Kolbe. And they did. They're from that parish. I said, I'm just reading a book right now about a man who was so taken by the strangeness of that story, trying to understand that phenomenon. And I said, that's really worth thinking about for all of us, is how do you explain him? How do you explain Maximilian Kolbe? He is an anomaly. If you put it in purely in terms of liberal modernity, you can't understand Maximilian Kolbe. So he opens a window. Yeah. He opens a window, and that's what the saints do in whatever age. They tend to open a window to the transcendent, So I love the fact that you started with him. I think it's very arresting.
And one of the questions you ask in the book as well that goes right into this kind of picture of Kolbe is our understanding of freedom. That Kolbe provides a very different understanding of that. And so what maybe was some insight or some enlightenment that Kolbe brought to you in regard to how we understand modernity and freedom and all of that versus what he provided?
So let me just make a general note about the book. Is each of the 12 questions, how do you justify your life, which is the C.S. Lewis question, or why should you want to take a day? Why should God want you to take a day off? Which is explored through the life of Abraham Joshua Heschel, to the question, what is freedom? Which is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. In each of these, there is a common thread, and that is that tradition, including religious tradition, but the other traditions as well, the pre-modern traditions seem to impose a limit on choice. And that limit at first looks restricting, which is why the modern age has shirked or sought to overcome those barriers altogether. But then we explore them, and you see that what looks like a barrier, what looks like a limit, is liberating, and that paradoxically, the demolition of that barrier makes us less free. So with Solzhenitsyn and what is freedom for? That chapter gets at this idea that freedom is only the moral theologians would say it's the ability to choose from among the widest range of contraries. I can choose, what kind of shoe I wear, and the goal of society as a whole is to maximize individuals' ability to choose, regardless of what the content of the choice is. Is there freedom to do evil things, or is that are acts that make you less free? In fact, that you can choose them willingly, but you're not made free as a result. And we see that in the life of Solzhenitsyn himself and the novels and kind of historiography he wrote about the Gulag, where in these conditions in which the amount of freedom, the amount of choice people can make in a gulag, right? He was this great Russian dissident, himself was imprisoned in the gulag system, is very narrow. And yet within those narrow choices, you can choose to elevate yourself, you can choose to ennoble yourself and your fellow prisoners, or you can make choices that actually degrade you. And so we see that just the ability to choose itself from a wide range of options isn't a satisfactory account of freedom. It's a too narrow account of freedom.
You know, the Solzhenitsyn chapter I found extremely interesting because I remember that speech. Wasn't it 1976 when he gave a speech at Harvard?
78.
78. So I would have been 18 at the time. And so you're right after the bicentennial of our country, right, in 1976. And I remember Solzhenitsyn giving that talk, and there was a natural affection for him. It's like, here's this guy who had been a prisoner for all these years, and of course, there's the great Solzhenitsyn. And he appears at Harvard looking for all the world like a Hebrew prophet. I mean, with the long beard and, the grave manner, and he's got that it was like a wrinkle carved in his forehead, And so people were, oh, how wonderful. But then he gives this speech that was sharply critical of the West, And I remember the negative reaction to it. I remember in the press, and who does this guy think he is? We gave him freedom, and he gets up here and slaps us in the face. But that's what makes it so powerful, isn't it? Is this very, very clear critic of communism, obviously, but then, also a critic. I'm not going to say maybe in the same level, but also a critic of Western liberalism that was proposing such an open-ended understanding of freedom. That it loses its way. And then it's someone like Sergei Pinker's, that we study a lot about the freedom of indifference versus the freedom for excellence, and that's the distinction. Modernity, following prompts from, I'd say, William of Ockham and then the great nominalist tradition, opts for freedom of indifference. So I got all these, as you say, all these choices, and not just yes or no. It's a whole range of options, and here I am sovereignly hovering above them, and I can say that's the one for me. Well, but that's not what classical people meant by freedom at all. They would have meant freedom from my various attachments, so I can be free for what's truly good. Yeah. I can be liberated from my own sinfulness, my own limitations, moral limitations, so that I can be properly limited, if you want. I can find the right context for my life. But we have lost a sense of that, I think. We have lost that in our culture. And we're beguiled by the freedom of indifference, and we want it just to expand it as much as possible. Let's have more and more and more choices, How often the language of choice, right, dominates our discourse. It just dominates our discourse. Increase my choice. Don't limit my choice. But that's not classical freedom at all. And Solzhenitsyn was indeed like a Hebrew prophet, or maybe a Russian Orthodox, prophet speaking that truth to our culture.
And when he, the shocking line that really scandalized his Western audience is, if I were asked if I would propose your society such as it exists now for the liberation of my people, meaning Russians trapped behind the Iron Curtain, I would have to say no. If you imagine in 1978, I was not born then, I was born in 1985, but in that atmosphere, how shocking it would be for someone who, as he wrote, I was expected to just come and sing the Immigrant's Ode to the great Atlantic fortress of liberty, and then he says, no, I have some criticisms, and it really unsettled his reception in the West ever after. I mean, he was he's a crank, he's a theocrat, he's a would-be dictator, so forth.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and it kind of displays an understanding of freedom in regard to hierarchy, that there's a transcendent freedom, a spiritual freedom that is much more important than even physical freedom, that goes back to Kolbe, that he just says that very clearly with his life. But speaking also of freedom and the intellectual life, to get back maybe to the second chapter when you talk about Aquinas, I always think about, when we're talking about freedom, the Chesterton analogy when he talks about children, that there's a fence, that the children are more free when the fence exists on the playground versus not, and they're closer to the building. So when I think about reason, theology, these things, there's the limitations or the refereeing that occurs there. But I appreciate how you take it from scientism into faith and reason to show how they actually correlate very well. So maybe extrapolate a little bit about that chapter in particular.
Yeah, I sort of hesitate sitting next to a
Sure.
Thomist, and here I am, a tabloid editor. But no, I mean, look, that chapter is also, there's a touch there which is in the footnotes, but not in the actual explicit in the text of the chapter, which is maybe the readers won't detect it, but is a big touch of Pope Benedict's Regensburg address in that chapter, which really, because I come from an Islamic background, I mean, obviously my family was super secular, and I was never really a deeply believing Muslim, but the Regensburg address tried to address, well, why is it that Islam, Christianity, and the secular West are all both in tension with each other, and ultimately, I mean, he pointed to a God of the Bible, who is reason itself, who is logos itself, and to me, the one son of the church above all, who took that idea to its absolute fullness in explicating it, is St. Thomas.
Boy, there's a lot there. It's very rich, and I'm thinking the link between, let's say, Solzhenitsyn at Harvard in 1978 and Benedict XVI in Regensburg, whatever year that was,
2006.
Similar, because you've also got a prophetic utterance there. What he was drawing attention to was the tradition of voluntarism within Islam. So let's say a stress upon the divine will and the divine power over the divine mind. And then the Christian, the biblical tradition, which stresses logos and reason, and the coming together of logos and will and God, right? That was the point he was making. And of course, it got sidetracked by a lot of the other concerns, but that was the argument he was making. And so the same complaint he has against the nominalists, and as they give rise to the reformers, and therefore I would say to much of modernity, because modernity is a reaction against God construed as sheer power, sheer arbitrary will. And so you're quite right, the Aquinas tradition that stresses logos and reason is a bulwark against voluntarism. And I've said over the years, maybe it's the greatest bacillus that gets into the system is voluntarism. The other thing about Aquinas I think is so helpful is very at the beginning of the Summa when he asked the question, why do we need divine science beyond the philosophical sciences? And the objector says, very reasonably, well, look, the philosophical sciences can tell us so much about God exists and all his attributes and so on. But Thomas's answer to that objection is, yes, but we have a desire for a good that goes beyond whatever reason can attain or the will can attain. And so we are ordered, if you will, by nature to a supernatural end. And so therefore it's only the God who addresses us out of the beguiling mystery beyond reason that can possibly satisfy the longing of the heart. It's a very interesting argument because it's giving full weight to reason. It's going all the way with reason, but acknowledging at the limit of reason, we're just getting started. It's like that's when the human spirit goes, yeah, but now that what I want is the good and the truth beyond these limits that I've come to. I think that's very rich stuff and needs to be recovered.
Bishop, speaking of Aquinas, and Sarab mentions this briefly in that chapter, is the issue of nominalism. You just mentioned voluntarism. I find it really fascinating that a lot of the issues we're dealing with in modernity are theological issues that we've been dealing with for centuries.
Yes, absolutely. There was a breakdown of a vision that Thomas would have taken for granted. Call it the analogical conception of being, right? That God is ipsum esse, God is the sheer act of to be itself, in and through which all creaturely existence abides. That gives you a very different view of the world than God as a kind of detached supreme being than all the other beings of creation. They're now kind of competing for space on the same ontological playing field. Ipsum esse is not in competition with his creatures. He can't be, right? The glory of God, therefore, is a human being fully alive. What happens, I think, with the nominalist view, the breakdown of the ipsum esse analogical conception, what you get is a competitive view of the relation between creatures and God. And then one more step into the reformers, who were very much shaped by nominalistic philosophy. To give God all the glory, I need to get no glory, right? If God gets everything, I should get nothing. So it's by grace alone. It's by God's revelation alone. And so the idea of our kind of cooperation with grace, that God wants us fully alive and all that begins to break down. Yeah. Now, next step, modernity reacting against that. Well, I don't want that. I don't want this God that's brooding over my freedom and God that's determining what I'm going to do. And so I'm going to now assert myself over and against that competitive God. Now welcome to Karl Marx and Ludwig Feuerbach. And so that's how I tend to see the trajectory there from even late medieval nominalism right through the reformers into modernity, into the atheist movement. Now, I'm speaking as a Thomist. Bring back Thomas Aquinas. Bring back that vision, and we overcome a lot of these obstacles.
It was one of the great insights of Richard Weaver that understood that in his book, Ideas Have Consequences, that
Yeah.
nominalism was the beginning of the problems of modernity.
Yes, in many ways. Yeah, and it's the breakdown of a particular metaphysical view. See, I mean, metaphysics, and you're good on this, always haunts us. I mean, you can deny metaphysics all you want, but everyone's got a metaphysical view. You know, it might be materialism, but that's a metaphysical view. And everything else flows from that. Everything's downstream from your metaphysics. So when we change the Thomistic, and I would bring that all the way back to Augustine and Irenaeus, you change that metaphysics into the competitive metaphysics of the nominalists, trouble ensues.
Yeah. And one of the losses that occurs that is actually in the next chapter as well, or I think a little bit later in the book perhaps, is the loss of Sabbath. I really, really appreciated the insights on that.
It's a good chapter.
Maybe provide a little bit of what that chapter was about and why that loss is such a, not just a cultural loss, but spiritual, metaphysical, numerous other aspects of a loss.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the question is, why would God want you to take a day off? And it's an especially pertinent question today because something like 20% of Americans consider, and a growing share of Americans consider themselves to be nuns. Many of them might have religious inclinations or spiritual inclinations, but they don't get things like Sabbath restrictions. So I begin with the fact that in 2019, North Dakota became the state that abolished the last statewide blue law that had been around since the 19th century. And it is a good question. I mean, in our day, we were liberated by cell phones. We were liberated by the nature of work has become a lot more fluid. So why would we need this one day off where you spend time with family and spend time with God in a secular society? And I tell the story of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, great mid-century Jewish intellectual, and an influence on the church's Nostra Aetate declaration. He was born into the Hasidic world in Poland, where the Sabbath obviously was the centerpiece of life. And he, again, to go back to this paradox that something that looks like a restriction is actually a source of liberation, he always emphasized the Sabbath as a source of interior freedom, that for one day a week, we set aside the acquisitiveness, the clamor of commerce, the competition with other human beings, and we leave what he called the realm of space, which is where most of modernity takes place, geopolitical contest, economic competition, and enter what he called the realm of time, which you can find in the Sabbath. And it's the realm of time in the sense that it is the place. This place is a weird way to talk about it, but where you are reminded of God, the only non-contingent eternal being, and you get to spend time with him. And I think that Sabbath vision is still, important for Christians as well. I mean, obviously, the day we sanctify is shifted, but the idea that you hallow the non-work of other human beings is not only good from a spiritual point of view, but it also turns out to be good from a kind of temporal point of view, because the Sabbathless world we've built, especially for working class people, is not a good world. We destroyed the Sabbath in the name of a kind of liberty. We squeezed out the liberty of the Sabbath for the liberty of the market, and you have situations in which the way large companies schedule work leaves no room for people to go to baseball games, for people to spend a day with family, and then we wonder, so why do we have such high divorce rates or such low rates of family formation? So in the chapter and in the book, I argue that we should try to restore blue laws, which is kind of maybe shocking, and a lot of, because I'm a man of the right and I'm in the kind of conservative world, a lot of my conservative critics would say that's authoritarian, or that's kind of it's an undue imposition on freedom. But if you're thinking about it, we had these laws going back to the colonial era, from a Protestant tradition that this country has as part of its DNA. In colonial Virginia even, not just in puritanical New England, but even in colonial Virginia, we had Sabbatarianism. In New Amsterdam, the Dutch imposed Sabbath laws. And this idea was deeply ingrained in the American spirit. It was only the past 3-4 generations that they began to chip away slowly at the freedom of the Sabbath in the name of a freedom of the market that I think ultimately has not served us well.
Yeah, I'll say something about that, Jared, because it happened in my lifetime, what you're talking about. I remember distinctly as a kid, so go back to the 1960s, society was altogether different on Sunday. It was altogether different. My mother would say to my father, like on Saturday night, "Oh, Johnny, you better go get the gas in the car now, because we got to go somewhere," and there's no gas station open. Stores weren't open. Theaters weren't open. And there was something really valuable about that, and we lost it in my lifetime. I remember it happened gradually, but then eventually it was like the Berlin Wall falling. It just suddenly, everything was open on Sunday. Sunday was another Saturday. When I was a kid, you'd never think of, we didn't have games on Sunday. We didn't have practice on Sunday, sports. I remember when my nephew was a little guy, maybe like 10 years old, and he had a basketball game, and it was on a Sunday morning. So I had mass, I remember, at the parish, and then he invited me, I went to the game. It was a Catholic league, and the coach was a Catholic. So after the game, my nephew brought me up, and I said, "Coach, thanks, y'all enjoyed the game." And I said, "But why do you have these boys playing on Sunday morning?" And he looked at me like, "I don't know what you're talking about." But that's not a healthy development in our culture. And of course, you see it with all the nuns, right? The NONES. Those who have just forgotten what religious practice looks like. Religion might be a little private hobby you have or a private conviction, but the idea that you ground it in certain practices, it would look like something, it would show up, your body would be involved, both space and time would be affected, etc. That's lost for a lot of people. But once that's gone, it's like pulling the plants out of the ground. I mean, they're just going to wither away. And so all the great fruits of religion, and morality and social cohesion and all that, that begins to be compromised for sure. And you're dead right, especially about the Sabbath and reclaiming the Lord's day. Keep holy the Sabbath as one of the most fundamental commandments of our biblical tradition. That's not a trivial matter. I mean, that's a really key matter. And I remember reading Heschel the first time when I was a young guy and read his book on the prophets and his book on the Sabbath and found that very powerful. So I'm glad you're recovering him, But it's much needed.
And we're reminded a lot of the work of Joseph Pieper
Yeah.
in regard to when you lose worship, the next
Yeah.
step is often leisure. And we think of leisure, we tend to think, well, if it's not creating some kind of economic opportunity for me, or if it's not increasing my income, then
Yeah.
what's the point?
What's the
Whereas the truly Christian thing is within that area of worship, you have the worship of God, but then you also have active leisure of the active mind growing. And we tend not to value that very much in our kind of commercial society.
The freedom to worship and the freedom to sanctify the Sabbath prefigures political freedom. Then Cardinal Ratzinger writes, right? In the Exodus account, God doesn't ask Pharaoh through Moses, "Let my people go so they can have their own country." He says, "Let my people go so they can serve me."
Yeah.
And then comes the political liberation of Israel.
Yeah, and that's really interesting as well, getting into the understanding of ritual and then the need for that, especially in regard to worship. In your chapter on Can You Be Spiritual But Not Religious, I thought I'd really love to hear from you on that insight of the couple that went to Africa and found out about this kind of ritual ideal that they found there.
So the couple are Victor and Edith Turner. Victor was an anthropologist, a Marxist, a card-carrying communist in Britain in the post-war era, and he married this woman, and she was equally committed to the same things, Marxist, Nietzschean, and generally very secular. But he had an academic interest in anthropology initially, and in rites of passage as an anthropologist. Why is it that traditional societies mark the transition from, for example, boyhood to manhood with these elaborate ceremonies, often involving grueling kind of tests for the young men, and whereas in the West, boyhood just sort of bled into adulthood in the modern West. So he goes to Africa and he embeds for 2.5 years in total with a tribe called the Ndembu in central South Africa. And to make a long story short, he begins to see that things happen in traditional African ritual. There are problems solved, intractable conflicts resolved through their practice of ritual that you couldn't do anywhere and anyhow else. And so by the time he comes back, as Edith Turner put it, we were looking for something of that sense of transcendence we found in tribal Africa, and we found it in the Roman Catholic Church. So they both converted as a result of their tribal experience, which is a very fascinating story. But what we know the Turners for is this theory of liminality, of what happens when people perform ritual, and it means that we leave our traditional hierarchical roles in society and enter this mysterious space. And in that mysterious space, all sorts of interesting things happen. So, for example, the chieftain among the Ndembu, before he becomes the chieftain, becomes liminal. And what that means is that the other villagers get to insult him. They get to say the worst things about him, mock him. And he's supposed to take it and not hold it against them once he's installed as the chief. So in the ritual, he learns that although he's the leader, he's really the servant of his community. And explicitly, the Turner said that reminded me of the Roman pontiff's role as a servant of the servants of God. There's nowhere else in our society where some of these things could happen. So the loss of ritual religion has not only left us with, I think, a kind of impoverished kind of spirituality because it's privatized. Well, I can do Dead Sea salt baths and I can meditate in a general way, but also we've lost this ability to connect with our human beings at a level of human kindness, as the Turners use the term.
Yeah, it's so rich, and that chapter I especially like because I didn't know that story about them. But I resonate completely with your idea there about ritual. A lot of my life as a priest and a bishop is about ritual. And if you're a pure rationalist, or let's say you're a commercialist, your life is all about just its commerce and organizing things rationally. Ritual seems silly, So I get dressed up in these sort of fancy clothes, and I perform these prescribed, movements and gestures. Thomas Merton said long ago, when he was asked about the Catholic Mass as a pre-conciliar, he said it's like a ballet with certain prescribed gestures and moves. But it seems silly to a purely rational consciousness. But when you're in touch with that beguiling mystery we talked about that lies beyond reason, that's how people have always enacted their relationship to that mystery, is by means of these repeated and usually communally shared, but also hierarchically ordered gestures and movements. But a rationalism will just look at that as a waste of time. It's just silly, But that you take an entire day, you take a Sabbath day, for example, and say at the heart of that Sabbath day is this great enactment, this beautiful, playful, in the Aristotelian sense, this sort of useless enactment. But when that's lost, the culture loses its very heart, And that's also the cut flowers thing. If you take spirituality, as people say today, but you pull it out of the ground of ritual, pull it out of the ground of Sabbath acknowledgement, it's going to fade away. And that's happening now. We see it all the time. It's happening in our culture, is things like moral conviction, things like social cohesiveness and so on will fade away because a lot of it does depend upon ritual consciousness. So it's an impoverished civilization that's forgotten about ritual, or that would see it as something primitive, and that would probably be the condescending way a lot of their colleagues would have seen it, like, oh, isn't that nice? Go to this primitive culture and they're still doing these little funny things, but that ain't primitive. I mean, that's as psychologically and spiritually sophisticated as you can get is the enactment of ritual. So I quite agree. That's part of that thread that we need to recover.
And one thing about ritual as well is that it fights this autonomy that we are currently dealing with today. Also, it fights a radical egalitarianism. That there still is a mode of hierarchical order, but at the same time, it still appreciates the individual. So in the work of Leonard Sachs, who got into a lot of this same theories, he talks about young men coming into manhood and how it was about them finding out about themselves in order to serve the community. And so if we're looking for a humanitarian need as a community, it seems to me that ritual would be one of the great ways to do it.
Well, I quite agree with someone like Richard Rohr that says we have a whole country full of uninitiated, especially young men. Yeah. So they've lost that sense of, as you're saying, an initiation ritual or some process by which you move into relationship with your family, with your wider community, with nature, ultimately with God. That was the trajectory of those initiation rituals among primal peoples. You got a whole nation filled with uninitiated boys, then they remain boys. They have the preoccupation of boys, even though they're 35 or 40 years old. And that's a major problem. I think look around our country, you see lots of examples of that, of uninitiated people they've not been ritually drawn into a relationship with these higher realities, and then they get the sense of service. Is a humility before nature, for example, a humility before your own community, and that your job is to contribute to their enhancement, and then finally humility before God, and that your life is lived in relation to God and God's will. But you lose all that. You don't have rituals for that. You never enact any of that. You get a lot of 45-year-old boys running around, and that's not good.
So to very briefly go back to my Maximilian, the one for whom this book was written, that's the anxiety. In other words, I tell the story of Maximilian Kolbe, his patron saint, fully adult, in fully free in a Christian sense. And then I flash forward to my son, imagining him as a, just out of college and then a little later in his 40s. And it's not like he's going to be, I think, knock on wood, economically he'll be fine. He'll probably go to an elite school. But it's that permanent boyhood that I worry about in the introduction, that he's dating this young woman and they've been doing it for 10 years, but he can't be encumbered by her, so he won't settle down, and his idea of time spent in leisure is video games, even as an adult. That's worrisome for me. And so, and ritual does so much to say, you are an adult now. Yeah. You are a man. Yeah, or a woman.
Did you, I might scandalize my viewers here, but I love the movie Fight Club, because Fight Club is about a lot of this, And that line, it was Brad Pitt, right, who says we're a bunch of 30-year-old boys. But what you see in that movie is what can happen to especially masculine energy when it's not properly directed, but also their weird attempt to find ritual. They were trying to find religion, but in this odd, dysfunctional way. That movie's very prophetic, it seems to me, of what goes wrong, especially with young men, and the danger of it. You're unleashing some real furies when you don't initiate young men properly, and ritual's got a lot to do with it.
Yeah, I think with Chris, men and women, whenever they aren't properly initiated into a community, there's an existential angst because they don't know who they are in regard to other human beings, in regard to themselves. And I think one of the insights also in this book that in regard to this is also what we've done with sex. And I thought in particular, the kind of surprising figure to me was Andrea Dworkin. Yeah. And so maybe extrapolate a little bit about why her in particular, and then what insight did she have and how we treat sex.
Well, I think because she was one of the first to notice that we live in a kind of sexually schizophrenic age, and the schizophrenia, since she died a few years ago, but that schizophrenia has heightened ever since then. Because on the one hand, we are constantly told to think of sex as something totally private, just enjoyable, and you should, seek your partner's consent and be healthy and use contraception, but otherwise you could do whatever, right? And it's a perfectly private thing with no wider social ramifications. In other words, what we do in the bedroom does not ripple out into how we structure our community. On the other hand, we're also living in an age of Me Too, where we see that that liberated ethic, as it turned out, has empowered a lot of caddish and horrible men, Harvey Weinsteins and so forth. And we're caught between the two. What do we do with the second one? Well, we can't rethink the sexual liberationism, because that's sacred. That's a fundamental liberal commitment. So we have to set up these drastic after the fact punishment mechanisms. And if some men are even falsely accused, then so be it. And so I think Andrea Dworkin, who was a radical feminist, really important figure in the 1980s, and uniquely in that time, she was anti-pornography, unlike a lot of the rest of the feminist movement. She was anti-prostitution, whereas the feminist movement defined herself in some ways against her by creating something called sex-positive feminism, where the idea was it doesn't matter if these things seem degrading as long as women take charge of it. And she thought, no, the thing itself is degrading, and so there's no way to redeem something like pornography. So she, I think, has insights that people of tradition, broadly understood, should listen to. The only problem is that what armory she had against the degradations she denounced was lacking. Ultimately, she came to conclude that, men are irreformable and we're just going to live in a sexually horrible world. And she dismissed natural law. She dismissed traditional barriers that traditional communities created between men and women to at least try to regulate lust. She didn't have any patience for all of that and saw it all as passé. So that's her shortcoming. But in her diagnosis, I argue, in some ways she was much more like a St. Augustine, where St. Augustine, there's a famous bit in City of God where he describes the Roman, the night of a wedding of a Roman bridegroom, and all the gods have to be there to hold down the woman, essentially, so that the groom can have sex with her. And St. Augustine recognizes the vulnerability and the kind of challenge to the woman what she's going through there, and that there's something uncomfortable about that. And he argues that has wider public ramification, that the lust for domination in that bedroom scene ripples out to the lust for domination of the Roman Empire, of pagan Rome. So in that sense, I argue, after a great Augustinian scholar, John Cavadini, that in some ways Dworkin was a misunderstood Augustinian. It's a provocative claim, but I think it's persuasive.
Does she actually use that phrase, libido dominandi, if she uses the Augustinian? The lust
Yes,
of
I believe so.
Because I found that fascinating. I didn't know her well at all. I knew the name, maybe, Andrea Dworkin, but I was very intrigued by the chapter. And because I remember during the Me Too movement, I kept thinking, yeah, if people followed the church's teaching on sexuality, we wouldn't have this problem. What people are complaining about is precisely an abusive objectification of another human being, not coupling sex with love and with commitment and devotion. And yeah, it's called classical Catholic sexual morality. That's what we should be doing. And the complaint was arising from a culture that said what you just described. No, sex is just for your pleasure. And then someone like Harvey Weinstein, talking about libido dominandi, if you're in that position to dominate someone, sure. And then it ripples out from the particular to the universal, because Augustine would have said the Roman gods and goddesses demonstrated the libido dominandi. And so you become what you worship. If that's what you think is the highest value, well then sure, the Roman emperor and the Roman imperium, it's all about dominating those around you. And if that's true, well then it trickles down into the private realm. So yeah, putting your finger on that problem, and then you turn to the New Testament. And we have an image of a crucified man. You turn to Maximilian Kolbe. It's not libido dominandi. It's the desire to give oneself. That's of enormous societal implication. So you are what you worship. What's the central value of your culture? And if she's putting her finger, on this problem that sexuality is so central to us, I think of sexual freedom. I think for our culture today, maybe that's the one great value. Don't limit my sexuality in any way. I have complete liberty in that. But if sexuality is just a place where the libido dominandi is expressed, then it's fallen, and it'll have implications way beyond itself. So I found that very intriguing, too, the way you played with that theme.
And one of the other chapters as well that gets into this understanding of freedom that also includes certain limitations or certain kind of referees, if you will, is Newman's understanding of conscience and authority. And I thought that's really interesting, especially in regard to this problem of sexual freedom, because in many ways the conscience was the thing that kind of regulated certain sexual activity, and what we've done is removed that and replaced it with will and desire, right? But at the same time, Newman still appreciates free thinking and the conscience and the beauty of it. But why in particular maybe Newman and the idea of conscience?
Well, we live in a world which was nascent when St. John Henry Newman was active, but is now taken for granted. And it's a world in which conscience and authority are treated as enemies. I want my conscience to be free, to be able to exercise my conscience on the moral dilemmas that life throws my way, and I shouldn't be encumbered, or I shouldn't be imposed upon by external authorities. And it's the worst thing not to be able to think for myself in that sense. So in the 19th century, in Britain, this challenge was, this very idea was used against Roman Catholics in Britain. And the occasion was the declaration of the First Vatican Council defining the doctrine of papal infallibility, and the reaction came in the form of William Gladstone, the great liberal prime minister. And he accused Catholics of essentially losing their mental freedom as a result of the papal declaration, because the Pope had said that when he speaks about faith and morals under certain strict conditions, then his rulings or decrees are infallibly binding on the minds of Catholics. And he said British Catholics are now subject to a kind of mental slavery. John Henry Newman comes around and he says that the idea of conscience that you have, Mr. Gladstone, is not what the 18th centuries prior to it thought of as conscience. Conscience was conscience insofar as it reflected an objective moral law. So it was the sort of the channel or the vessel for some objective norm that was embedded in the human heart. And so if that's conscience, in some ways, true authority is its friend, because that authority also reflects the same voice, especially, in this case, papal authority. So the Pope wouldn't attack true freedom of conscience, because if he did that, he would be undercutting his own authority. It's a brilliant argument. Ultimately, I would argue in that exchange of polemics, John Henry Newman, who's the far better polemicist, even though he's very gentle about how he does this, won out. But I think in the world at large, I think we live in the world that Gladstone built, in which conscience and authority are treated as though they're enemies, rather than allies and friends.
Oh, and that speaks, of course, to our different understanding of freedom. So freedom of indifference, then, right, conscience and authority are the problem. But freedom for excellence, no, conscience and authority are my friends. They guide my freedom. But it always strikes me as funny. And I want to say, give me a break. In the wider culture today, I'm for freedom. I do whatever I want. I set the tone. Come on. Look at a lot of young people in our culture. They all dress alike. They talk alike. They follow the prompts of the pop stars. They do exactly what's expected and demanded of them. How many are really exhibiting this heroic freedom? Come on. Most of them are following an authority, but it might just be from a pop star, or it might be from politicians, or from the voices of the culture, or from their own friends. So the claim that we religious people are we're beholden to this external authority. Everyone's got an authority. Everyone's freedom, when you really get down to it, is guided by something. The question is, is it something good or something bad?
And if you're bound to a true authority that reflects the voice of that interior, aware of your own interior awareness of a universal moral law, then you're actually much less likely to be pulled around or swayed by this advertiser, that fake news meme, this demagogue. You're someone who's grounded to authority or bound to an authority has a kind of steadiness, I think.
And you can stand up to a Nazi guard with a gun and say, I'm going to give my life for this person.
I'll take his place.
You can be Maximilian Kolbe, who was the freest man in Europe, in that day. But no, that's a lesson worth teaching over and over again to our culture.
Yeah, and from there, I think it's a very poignant ending to the book that you bring up Seneca and the idea of death, which is, especially in light of our reaction to COVID, we really don't want to think about it. We want to avoid it at all costs. So why in particular, as this is advice to your son, why in particular Seneca's view?
So no one has, in the history of, I think, Western thought, given more attention to the question of death than the Roman philosopher Seneca. Seneca the Younger, or just Seneca. And to be very clear, and people point this out about the book, the traditions represented in this book don't speak univocally. In other words, there are tensions. We'll get to Seneca's views in depth, but clearly he and Augustine would have disagreed about suicide. Mm-hmm. Seneca was far too quick to say, well, if you're in a tough situation, be willing to just take your life, in a way that obviously in the City of God, Augustine prescribes or condemns. But nevertheless, I think there's something we can learn from a Seneca in terms of recognizing, even as Christians who view death as an unfortunate thing inscribed in human nature by our first ancestors' sins. Nevertheless, it's a reality, and being able to accept it in the right place is another good limit to submit to. And the contrary view, that you should try to hold on to life as much as possible, in an irrational way, including now by technological means, where we're trying to look at how altering genomes and so forth can extend the human lifespan. Seneca, writing in the first century A.D., saw these things coming in some ways. I mean, he saw his fellow Romans just holding on to life at the price of any indignity, and he said, "You're not actually living well because you live in such fear of death." And he had a respiratory illness that constantly choked him up, and when it happened, it felt like he was dying. And this kind of made him comfortable with death in a way, because he tested it daily, or it tested him daily. And it taught him to think of death as, in some situations, as a source of liberation when you're faced with committing grave sins just to hold on to your life. Better to not do that. And it gives you a kind of sense of solidarity with your fellow human beings. And I mean, as he was an advisor to Nero, he was a senator under Caligula. In all these situations, he worked for the common good, out of this sense that we're all in this march toward death together. And it's foolish for any one person to try to march the other way and insist that they can run away from natural death.
Remember the line from A Good Man's Hard to Find, when the misfit says about the grandmother whom he's just killed? She would have been a good woman if there'd just been someone to hold a gun against her head every moment of her life. That there's something about the knowledge of death. And Flannery O'Connor, the author of that story, had lupus, and she knew she was going to die young, which indeed she did. She did have a gun against her head every moment of her life, and that opens something up. The other thing I thought of, I'll tell you, it's a story. I won't give the name, but pretty well-known TV person out here. I was at a gathering here in Santa Barbara, and there was this well-known figure, and we fell into conversation, and he was doing just what you said. He said, the technology, and I think I could live to be 125, and if I do this and that. And I said, oh my God, why would you want to? Like that. And he looked at me with complete incomprehension, like, well, what do you mean? If I could, of course I would. And I said, I don't know. I mean, as though this life is it, this is it, and just to make this as long as we possibly can, that can't be it. There's something that stretches beyond this life, and there's a higher. But it was just, that was opaque to him. And it was just, let's make this life as long as we possibly can. Hold off death as long as you possibly can. And that's a different metaphysic, isn't it?
Well, and Seneca says, and it's a beautiful line, he says, you've tasted wine, you've tasted mead, you know what oysters taste like, you know what delicacies like mushrooms taste like, and yet these are the things for the sake of which you hold on to life in a base and degraded manner and live fearfully. How much more wine? Life gets boring, and like a good story, it should have a beginning, middle, and an end. And it's the possibility of an end that gives life to it gives meaning to the part that's the life part. It's the possibility of a story without stakes is a boring story. A story has to have a stake, and it's in relation to death that the sacrifice of a Maximilian Kolbe really stands out. If you don't have death as this end, at least for natural life, life gets boring. It becomes plastic, I think.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting insights of the martyrs, that they really, one of the great fears of all human life is death, and yet they embrace it like a friend. Mm-hmm. They're not fearful of it, which, talking about freedom, that's a whole nother level of freedom that even death itself we're not fearful of. And we only have a few more minutes here, but and I always like to kind of end these on some understanding of, like, maybe prescription. What do we do? We've talked a lot about some of the issues going on. Maybe, Saurabh, we'll start with you on what advice would you give for people who find themselves in a similar position, or maybe some insight came from this conversation that they really want to either dive a little bit deeper, and then also some understanding of, as Catholics, as Christians, what do these insights offer in regard to evangelization?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would say, first of all, as Catholics, we can stand comfortably in relation to these other traditions. C.S. Lewis was a Protestant. Abraham Heschel was a Hasidic rabbi. Andrea Dworkin was a radical left-wing feminist. But Confucius, which we didn't talk about, is kind of pagan Chinese. But that because our God is a reasonable God, to go back to the Aquinas question, we have a lot of scope in natural reason to learn about about and from other traditions. But for me, ultimately, I mean, and I end the book with a letter to my son, where at the end of the day, I say, I hope that you consult in all your major life decisions sound authorities, above all that of Holy Church. That it's the Church's teaching and its wisdom and its magisterium, its capital T tradition, incorporates so much of this. So in a way, this is a story-driven way to find a lot of insights that you'll also find in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, the 1992 document, which is a beautiful document, and it's such a joy to read for the kind of document that it is. So I guess I hope as a writer, as a father, I hope that the book prompts people to dig into these traditions, but ultimately within the framework of the Church, which gives a much more systematic account and corrects for the errors of a Seneca. The Church Fathers largely praised Seneca, but still, on the question of suicide, for example, we have to part ways with him. And I want to be very clear about the book that there are points of tension between what we Catholics believe and what some of the figures profiled in this book believed.
Yeah, it's a good question, Jared. I'm kind of trying to think it through. I'll first say this. I can't think of anything more boring than sheer freedom. So what's proposed as the great goal of everything, to be free. Ho-hum. I mean, I'm just sort of this aimless, what do I do? Who am I? I'll decide. I'll decide. What do I know? What's exciting is when you intuit objective values. So at the epistemic level, at the moral level, at the aesthetic level, when you see these great values and you're introduced to them, and now you go on this great adventure of exploring these values. So that's what a book like yours does for a lot of people. They open up these worlds of meaning and so on. But then I'd add this. It's never a dead traditionalism, like, okay, I'm just going to simply, repeat what I've already heard. No, now is the invitation to real adventure. So get past this boring, pure freedom stuff and this Nietzschean self-invention. Bore me to death with that. But having been introduced to the world of values, now you got a role to play. Now you're not going to a museum looking around at, look at those wonderful things. Now you become an artist with your own life. You become a poet. You become a spiritual adventurer. You become your own version of Maximilian Kolbe. So it's not a dead traditionalism. It's a exciting spiritual adventure. You're on a high adventure in the spiritual life, but it's grounded in the great tradition. And it's not just this vapid, boring freedom. It's the real freedom that the tradition opens up. So that's the space, I think, to move into, somewhere between boring modern freedom and then a dead traditionalism is this exciting. It's like when a kid, I remember learning baseball, and I watched the great players of that time, long before your time, and you were in Iran anyway, you wouldn't have known that probably, but I'm watching these great, but then the fun of it was, now I get to play, and I'm not as good as those people, but who cares? I was able to play in my own way and so on. And that's what the spiritual life is like, and the moral life. So that's my little exhortatio, I suppose.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, this has been a terrific conversation. And so, Rob, thank you so much for joining us. And Bishop Barron, as always, thank you so much. And everyone watching it.
Peace be with you. Friends, if you've been following these sermons of mine the past couple months, I've been focusing very much on the first readings, coming up out of the Old Testament, because I think we Catholics especially aren't that great at understanding the Old Testament. So today I'm going to look at this marvelous passage from the book of the prophet Ezekiel. Now, Ezekiel, one of the four major prophets, along with Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Daniel, also one of the most theologically profound and one of the most mysterious of the prophets. In fact, ancient Israel had an adage that one should not even approach Ezekiel till you're about 50. They thought prior to that, you just didn't have what it takes to read a text as complex as this one. So we'll be reading from Ezekiel today, and the passage is from the 18th chapter. Now, I think the 18th chapter of Ezekiel represents a real breakthrough in the consciousness of the West. I'm a student of philosophy, and you look at people like Socrates and Plato and so on, who did indeed represent great breakthroughs or kind of watershed figures. But mind you, they're operating around the year 400 BC. Ezekiel, we're talking about 590, 580 BC. Nearly 200 years before Socrates and Plato, this figure is operating and writing. And I think this chapter 18, I recommend, by the way, get your Bibles out and just read that 18th chapter, does represent a very important breakthrough. Now, let me explain what I mean. Our passage today, or rather the chapter commences with a rehearsal of a proverb that was evidently popular among the ancient Israelites. Here's the proverb. The parents have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. See what that means? The parents eat the sour grapes, but the children suffer for it. The implication seems to be that the children and grandchildren and descendants of those who've done wicked things are punished for the wickedness of their forebears. But see, here's Ezekiel's point. God is having none of that. Listen, as I live, says the Lord God, this proverb shall no longer be used in Israel. It's very interesting now. It's very interesting. See, ancient Israel, like most ancient peoples, thought not so much in terms of the individual. See, and we're on the far side of that divide. I mean, we are so characterized by individualism that we probably need a little balancing. But see, these people tended to think that your family identity, your tribal identity, your national identity was more important than you. And so they had no trouble thinking, yeah, if someone sinned way back then, of course his descendants are implicated because it's your tribe, it's your family, matters more than you. But Ezekiel's saying, and I think it's a breakthrough, God says, no, that won't work. Listen now what he says as he channels the words of the Lord. Know that all lives are mine, the life of the parent, as well as the life of the child. But it is only the person who sins that shall die. And he spells this out now in some detail. Listen, if there is a person who's done all things well, it's been righteous, I'm quoting now, but whose son is violent, a shedder of blood, defiles his neighbor's wife, oppresses the poor, lifts up eyes to idols, shall he then live? He shall not. You see, his point there is the son who's wicked can't wrap himself in the mantle of his father's virtue. If you're thinking purely in tribal terms, yeah, okay, maybe, hey, I'm still benefiting from what my great-grandfather did. No, says the Lord, I know both the Father and the Son. And the wickedness of one belongs to him. The virtue of the other belongs to him. Here's how he spells out the other side. No virtuous son shall suffer for the wickedness of his father. Here's the Lord speaking now. A child shall not suffer for the iniquity of a parent, nor a parent suffer for the iniquity of a child. The righteousness of the righteous shall be his own. The wickedness of the wicked shall be his own. Here, I think, is what the prophet Ezekiel, under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, is helping us to see. Though family identity is real, no one's denying that. Tribal identity, our sense of belonging to something bigger than ourselves. Yes, that's all true. More to it, and though our moral acts always have implications, that's also true. You know, they can have negative impact on people that come after us. That's certainly true. Nevertheless, in the moral act, the individual gathers himself, defines his character, stands in a very real and important sense alone in the presence of God. Let me say that again. In the moral act, I gather myself. I define my character. I stand on my own 2 feet in the presence of God. Again, these acts take place in the real world. Yeah, influenced by family, culture, society. Yeah. All that's true. Nevertheless, I show God and the world who I am in the quality and integrity of my moral acts. You know, can I put my philosopher's hat on just for a second? Again, St. Thomas Aquinas always comes through in a pinch with the pithy distinction. Thomas distinguishes between what he calls an actus hominis and an actus humanus. What's an actus hominis? That means an act of a man. So let's say I sneeze. That's an act of a man. But it's not a human act. What do I mean? Well, it's not an act by which I am gathering and consciously defining myself. It's an instinctual reaction. Or someone comes up and they startle me and I jump. Well, that's an actus hominis, an act of a man, but not an actus humanus. An actus humanus, a human act, involves the full engagement of the mind. I know what I'm seeking. I know the nature of this. And the full engagement of the will. I choose. I decide. Now, both those things, mind and will, influenced by forces outside, sure they are, of course they are. But nevertheless, at that decisive moment, when I gather myself, knowing what I'm doing, choosing it consciously, in that great actus humanus, in that great human act, I stand before God. I stand on my own 2 feet. And I define my character. You know, it comes to mind here too, and I reference my favorite movie, Man for All Seasons, a lot. The great St. Thomas More, when he's up against the pressure of King Henry VIII to give in, as everyone, all the leaders of that society had given in. And More is talking to his best friend, Norfolk. And Norfolk's trying to persuade him, you know, like, Thomas, come on, we've all given in. And More says, in regard to his own convictions, but it's that I believe it. And then he says, well, but rather no, not that I believe it, but that I believe it. And see, in some ways, that's the fulcrum on which that whole movie turns. Not that I believe it, but that I believe it. More at that moment was summing up his whole life, defining who he was, not wrapping himself in the mantle of his virtuous predecessors, not suffering from the wickedness of his friends around him. But at that moment, fully engaging mind and will, engaging in an actus humanus, that I believe it. Now we know who he is. Now we know where he stands. Here's something from the philosopher Dietrich von Hildebrand, who loved the 3 transcendentals, the good, the true, and the beautiful, right? Von Hildebrand said, you know, look, truth, wonderful. Every philosopher seeks it. But what a wonderful thing if you're educated and you learn to read books and to think deeply and to entertain, you know, high ideas. But we would say if someone were incapable of that, let's say they weren't that intelligent, they weren't well educated, they weren't given access to books, etc., we'd say, well, that's sad. That's unfortunate. Or let's say the beautiful, someone with a great aesthetic sensibility. You know, they appreciate fine art. They can even create fine art. How wonderful, Michelangelo and so on. And if someone were deprived of that, they never got an aesthetic education, they had a talent that was never cultivated, we'd certainly say that's a sadness. But in regard to the good, to the morally upright, if someone's incapable of that, they fail in that regard. We don't just say how sad. We say that that's a calamity, that that's a tragedy. We're not going to morally blame someone that doesn't become a great philosopher or a great artist, but we are going to morally blame someone who doesn't cultivate the moral dimension of his life. What von Hildebrand shows there is the primacy of the good, the primacy of the moral. And in light of Ezekiel, how it's the moral act that defines who I am. Just one more reference to another hero of mine, namely St. John Paul II. So Karl Wojtyła, you know, was a great moral philosopher. That was his area of expertise. And he said this in his moral writings. Every time we perform a moral act, we make a moral decision, we do 2 things. One is we affect the world in a particular way. We do this. We move in that direction. We take this action. But then Wojtyła said, in a deeper way, we also are creating the person we are becoming. Let's think about that. Now, there's a direct line, it seems to me, from Ezekiel to John Paul II. When I make a moral decision, now mind you, I'm not talking about my decision to watch the baseball game or watch a movie. I mean, that's a decision, but not a morally important decision. I decide to have a ham sandwich or a turkey sandwich. That isn't a morally relevant decision. But in the presence of a moral choice, knowing full well what's at stake, fully engaging my will, when I do that sort of act, I perform that kind of act, I'm defining the character that I'm becoming. Think of every moral act, this is a Wojtyła idea, it's like a little brick in the wall. And with each one of those acts, I'm building up the edifice of my own character. And keep that in mind, everybody. That's a very important idea. Again, I'm not talking, movie versus baseball game. I mean, every time in the course of the day, when you take a moral decision, you're not wrapping yourself in the mantle of your grandparents. You're not suffering because of what your children might be doing. But at that moment, you are standing in a self-defining way in the presence of God. I think Ezekiel chapter 18 represents a great breakthrough in consciousness. Now come all the way up through Thomas More, all the way to St. John Paul II. And keep that in mind as you're moving through your day and you're making moral choice after moral choice. You're affecting your world. You're also defining the person you are becoming. And God bless you. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, I encourage you to share it and be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Peace be with you. Friends, I love how all three of the readings for the second Sunday of Lent call to mind the mystical, the strange, the transcendent world. That's the goal of all of our religious striving. Our first reading for the book of Genesis talks about the covenant that the Lord makes with Abraham. He has to cut these animals in two, and then this strange darkness descends, and this flame passes through the severed pieces of the animals. A voice is heard. All these symbols are meant to evoke this mystical and strange higher world with which Abraham is having intercourse. In other words, it's never just a question of what goes on within this realm of our experience, but we have a relationship to this higher reality, which is summoning us. Then the second reading from Paul to the Philippians. Let me just read a little bit to you. But our citizenship, he tells the Philippians, is in heaven. And from it, we also await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. Listen now. He will change our lowly body to conform with his glorified body. Extraordinary lines, aren't they? At the very beginning of the church, when there were a handful of Christians around the world. But Paul speaks with this extraordinary confidence that, our citizenship, even though we live in this ordinary world, and he's thinking about the culture of ancient Rome and so on, but we don't have our citizenship here. Our citizenship, where we really belong, is in heaven. From heaven we await the coming of the Lord, when he will conform these lowly bodies of ours to be like his own glorified body. What does that mean? Well, I don't think we really know. Elsewhere, Paul talks about a spiritualized body. Our same body. I mean, he's a Jew. He wasn't thinking of souls escaping from bodies so much. That's Plato. He's a Jew. He's thinking of, me. I am my body. But what we await is a glorification, an elevation, a perfection beyond our imaginings of this lowly body of ours. Okay? With that kind of mystical consciousness, we should turn to the famous gospel reading, which is Luke's account of the Transfiguration. Now, say what you want about these stories. Say what you want about this event that inspired them. It fascinated the first Christians. And it has continued to fascinate Christians up and down the centuries. The story of Jesus' transfiguration. The Greek behind that term, so transfiguratio would be a Latinization of the Greek, which means metamorphosis. He was metamorphosed before them. That means, morphe means form, meta, beyond. He went beyond the form that he had. What does that mean? I don't think we entirely know. But something so strange happened that this ordinary Jesus from Nazareth, look, he certainly said and done extraordinary things at this point, but he looked for all the world like anybody else. You know, he's a physical human being and wearing the clothes everybody else wore. There was nothing remarkable about his appearance. In fact, do you find this intriguing? I always have. Nowhere in the New Testament is there any reference to what Jesus looked like. Isn't that peculiar? Odd, isn't it? This figure of supreme importance to them. There's not one reference to what he looked like. Well, I mean, clearly he was an ordinary man of that time and culture. Except at this moment. Except here on that holy mountain when he was metamorphosed. He went beyond the form that he had. Can we think caterpillar butterfly? I know it's a kind of hackneyed image, but a metamorphosis of this kind of lowly grub, this lowly critter, becoming this splendid butterfly. Something happened that so impressed them that you hear it reflected in these stories, and it's impressed Christians up and down the ages. Let me just give you a little hint here of how they tried to describe it. While he was praying, his face changed in appearance. What does that mean? I don't know entirely. His clothing became dazzling white. It's different. It's as though his deepest identity became clear, became transparent. It's as though the divinity within him shone through his physicality, that very physicality was elevated and changed and became resplendent. His glorified human body was on display. That seems to be what they're talking about. I love how Thomas Aquinas said that the purpose of the Transfiguration was in the midst of this kind of slog through Jesus' public life, which had glorious moments to be sure, but also had a lot of struggle and opposition, and that during that slog, the disciples got this glimpse. That's who he is. That's what he's finally about. And dare they dream it? That's what's in store for us. That our bodies, as Paul says, might be transfigured too. What we're talking about here, everybody, is the glorified body in heaven. The goal, if you want, of the spiritual life. Now look, I came of age after Vatican II, and everyone and his brother and sister put a huge stress on this worldly dimension of the faith. And fine, are there implications for social justice and concern for the poor and making this world a better place? Yes, absolutely. However, show me one text in Vatican II or anywhere else in our great tradition that says the church is only about making this world better. No. The church from the beginning has been fascinated by this perfection on high to which we tend, this properly supernatural goal that's held out to us. And these readings in their own way, and it's lovely as we are going through kind of the slog of Lent, that we get a glimpse too of this. Okay, with that in mind, I want to look just really briefly at the way St. Thomas Aquinas describes the glorified body. And you say, oh, isn't he just sort of wildly speculating? Well, no, it's based upon texts such as this and also the text about the resurrected Jesus. But also, how wonderful that we are thinking about what life will be like on high. And these readings prompt this meditation. Okay. Here's the first quality, Aquinas says, of the glorified body. It has identity. That means it is in some very basic way in continuity with these bodies here below. Now, think for a minute, everybody. This body that you see before you, well, is this the same body I had when I was 5 years old? Well, yeah, in a way, because the form and structure of it remains, but heck, every cell, molecule in my body when I was 5 is different now, right? What do the scientists tell us? They're replaced completely every, I don't know what it is, several months or years. The point is there's a kind of discontinuity, even in this life. But yet I say, no, that 5-year-old Bob Barron, who was playing baseball back in Birmingham, Michigan, is the same one standing before you now. There's identity, even though this body is also radically different. Well, so in heaven, there'll be a continuity with this body, but yet a great difference, an elevation, a transformation, a transfiguration. Aquinas says, will people be able to recognize us? Yeah, because it's the same body. But again, think caterpillar butterfly. I'll be myself, but myself at such a higher pitch of perfection. Here's the second trait he thinks of the glorified body. He calls it quality. That means the glorified body will be at the height of its powers, possessing a full integrity. It's all of us as we get older. You reach a certain point in life where you're kind of at the height of your powers, and then, let's face it, the powers begin to wane. We weaken. We lose our capacity. I mean, I remember quite vividly when I could still play football and basketball at a pretty high level. Get me out there on a basketball court now, forget it. I mean, those powers have kind of waned. I'm satisfied now with a round of golf. It's because I don't have the physical power I used to have to run up and down a court. Well, in heaven, Aquinas says, there'll be no loss of these powers, but rather we're at the highest pitch. And then thirdly, relatedly, the glorified body, Thomas says, has impassibility. That means it will not change or diminish. So as I say, it's one of the sadnesses of this life, and every poet and novelist in some ways talks about it, is that I change and I diminish, I lose what I have. But no, in heaven, in the glorified body, at the full pitch of my power and integrity, I don't lose that. I retain this perfection of being, impassibility. Fourthly, Aquinas says, this beautiful idea, the resurrected body will have agility. And what he means here is very specific. He means that the body will be able to respond utterly and perfectly to the promptings of the soul. So right now, my body is responding, if you want, to the promptings of my soul. I'm imagining a goal, I'm willing it, and then I'm instantiating it through the movements of my body. Okay, so I've got agility, and I can, please God, in a few minutes, I can walk out of this place back to my car. I've got sufficient agility to do that. But this body of mine can't do everything that I want to do, everything I imagine. I mean, heck, I like to play basketball like Michael Jordan. I like to swing a golf club like Rory McIlroy, but I can't do that. My body can't respond with perfect agility to the promptings of my soul, but Aquinas says in heaven, it can. His justification for this is the resurrected Jesus, who can, yes, even pass through walls. Though the place where they were locked in for fear of the Jews, we hear, Jesus came and stood in their midst. That's the agility of his resurrected body, that we can respond in the wink of an eye to the most extravagant yearnings of our will and imaginings of our mind. That's agility. And then finally, Aquinas says the resurrected body has clarity or luminosity, claritas in his Latin. And how wonderful it's correlated to the story of the Transfiguration, that Jesus became dazzlingly bright, the light of the Transfiguration. Why is it? This is true even across the cultures. Why is it that we associate holiness with light? Why we put halos around the heads of the saints? Why is it that in lots of stories of holy people, light is associated with them? There's that wonderful story, Malcolm Muggeridge, the man who really brought Mother Teresa to the consciousness of the world, that when he went to film in her place there where she cared for the sick and the dying, the lights failed. The lights they had brought failed. And his producer said, it's just not going to work. Let's not do it. And Muggeridge said, no, just go ahead and film anyway. Let's see what happens. And when the film came back, they were astounded because there was this luminosity all through the room that allowed them to film perfectly. What was that? But some anticipation of this claritas of the resurrected body. I, years ago, met this older man who, when he was a young kid in the army, World War II, had heard about this Italian holy man, Padre Pio, and he went with a buddy of his, and they went to serve his mass. And he said to me, and his eyes filled with tears as he told the story, he said, as he lifted the host up, he said, "Father, believe me, I wasn't dreaming." All around his hands and around the host was a bright light. It's the claritas, the luminosity of holiness. And so our resurrected, glorified bodies, luminous with the holiness of God. Think on these things, everybody. As we're making our kind of tough slog through Lent, think of these things. What God holds out to us